Welcome everyone to tonight's event, and thank you so much for joining us. We would like to first acknowledge that Dalhousie sits on the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. We also acknowledge the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people and communities who have been here for over 400 years. My name is Rachel Banks, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the Irving Glovin Lecture tonight. This event is made possible by the Oskar Schindler Humanities Foundation, who also support a variety of programs at Dalhousie that create opportunities for critical thought and dialogue about the nature of ethical practice, such as the Irving and Jean Glovin Award in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. This award provides a generous incentive for students from various disciplines to explore the principles and practices of good human conduct in a diverse and globally connected world. We are very fortunate to have such generous support for learners and scholars in the Dalhousie community. So closed captioning for this event is available under the CC icon, and you are welcome to post questions in the Q&A chat, which should be under the Q&A icon during and after the presentation. I will be relaying those questions to the speakers for their responses after the talk. And I will now welcome Dr. Lissa Skitolsky, the Simon and Reba Spatz Visiting Chair in Jewish Studies at Dalhousie University, who will introduce tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Lewis Gordon. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this evening's discussion.
Excuse me, your mic's muted.
Great. Thank you for your patience, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am so thrilled to introduce Dr. Lewis Gordon to present the inaugural Irving Glovin Lecture, and I am so honored that I was given the opportunity to choose the very first speaker for this new lecture series made possible by the generosity of Shirley Mencher and Dr. George Mencher in order to honor and continue the work of Irving Glovin, George's uncle, who led an extraordinary life that included serving as a lieutenant in the US Army during World War II, hiding his Jewish identity as a German prisoner of war, and working closely with Oskar Schindler as his friend and attorney, all of which inspired his devotion to the examination of good conduct as a political and moral response to the horrors of Nazism. And this devotion led him to create, with his wife, Jean Glovin, the Oskar Schindler Humanities Foundation Endowment Fund, which has supported programs at Dalhousie, University of New Haven, and the University of Southern California that provide opportunities for students and faculty to critically engage the question of what good conduct means in a genocidal world. For this reason, I felt an enormous responsibility to invite a scholar whose research and life illustrate the devotion to ethics that emerges from a love of diversity and the desire to protect and honor the diversity of different human communities, as well as the diversity within each community, in order to both exemplify the aim of the Irving Glovin Lecture and to provide a cause for some much needed hope that can enhance our ability to navigate the present. And this certainly describes the importance of Dr. Gordon's wide-ranging and interdisciplinary research in Africana philosophy, phenomenology, existentialism, social and political philosophy, Jewish history, aesthetics, philosophy of culture, and philosophy of psychoanalysis that have earned him international acclaim as an Afro-Jewish philosopher, global political thinker, educator, and all-around mensch. Dr. Gordon is professor of philosophy with affiliation in Jewish studies, Caribbean and Latin American studies, Asian and Asian American studies, and international studies at the University of Connecticut. He is the author of 18 books, including most recently, Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, with Routledge in 2021, and the forthcoming and hotly anticipated Fear of Black Consciousness, due out in January 2022, with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in the US, and with Penguin Books in the UK. Dr. Gordon is also the author of over 90 articles in peer-reviewed journals and about a dozen peer-reviewed encyclopedia entries, including a forthcoming article on Jewish diversity for the reference series Bloomsbury Religion in North America. Dr. Gordon is also the editor of the American Philosophical Association blog series Black Issues in Philosophy, and the co-editor with Dr. Jane Anna Gordon of the book series Global Critical Caribbean Thought and the journal Philosophy and Global Affairs. It actually feels a bit awkward to introduce Dr. Gordon by citing his incredibly impressive credentials, because they are not actually the reason that I desperately wanted him to be the first speaker of the Irving Glovin series, but instead because of how Dr. Gordon engages with people and facilitates community, as his enthusiasm for dialogue is just one expression of his deep and abiding respect and concern for others that enables those in relation to him to feel both seen and heard. In my experience in academia, it's not very common that a prolific and accomplished global scholar makes it difficult to feel intimidated in conversation, because he makes you feel like talking and listening to you is the most important pressing matter at hand. Further, listing Dr. Gordon's credentials can't really convey the existential importance of his work that helps us to better understand the complex and historically specific terms of identity formation in a way that allows us to re-examine ourselves and those unstated assumptions that often serve to reinforce divisions between and within groups and preclude our appreciation for shared histories, values, and commitments. This is certainly reflected in Dr. Gordon's groundbreaking work in Afro-Jewish history and culture that we will hear about tonight, and that for me personally has completely changed the way that I understand my history, identity, and commitments as a Jew. In 2004, Dr. Gordon founded the only existing Center for Afro-Jewish Studies at Temple University. And in his widely circulated article titled Rarely Kosher, Studying Jews of Color in North America, published in the journal American Jewish History, Dr. Gordon provides a succinct explanation for the need and importance of such a center when he explains, and now I'm going to quote the article, that the term Jews of color would certainly, quote, seem odd to prior generations of Jews and anti-Semites, for both knew that Jews, or at least Judeans, as a group, were certainly not white, but race is permeable. And as some Jews became white, a misperception emerged, oddly enough, in which supposedly most Jews became white. As there were once no Jews who were white, this strange development means that large groups of non-white Jews simply disappeared, or at least disappeared as Jews. So now I really need to stop introducing, but I do want to extend my thanks, as always, to Gail Quigley-Smith and Janet Dyson for their invaluable help in organizing the lecture tonight, and to Dr. Roberta Barker and Tara Graham for their enthusiastic support. And of course, I want to give special thanks to the Oscar Schindler Humanities Foundation and to George and Shirley Mencher for creating this lecture series and for their continued support of Jewish studies and ethical engagement at Dalhousie University. So without further ado, I am happy to welcome Dr. Gordon to present his reflections on Africana Jewish studies.
Thank you, Lissa. And also thank you, Shah Harrison, Rachel Banks, the community that organized this forum, and the namesake of this lecture series for, frankly speaking, courage and commitment. And some of this will come out in some of the reflections I have to offer, because right away, one of the things we know is that courage is not about the absence of fear. Courage is about the willingness to face that fear with the understanding that you could lose. I begin also by saying, Wanikisuk, and this is because I'm in New England, and the indigenous peoples in this area, among them include the Wampanoag. Those are the people who met the Pilgrims when they came to what became North America. And I bring up the Wampanoag because a very close friend, pretty much a family member, Donna Mitchell, was a Wampanoag. She passed away a few years ago, and if she were alive, she would have not only been looking at this, but she would have also gathered members of the community in the spirit of what it is for us to affirm our common humanity. Now, I also would like to add Hotep, which is the ancient Kemetan word for peace. And as we know, I could say Laila Tov, because where many people are, it's evening, but I'll also say Shalom, peace. And Assalamu alaikum to our Muslim sisters and brothers. And I'll also say, because you'll hear tonight a little bit about my ancestry, I'll say Mantia Vanakam, which is Tamil for the same thing, for hello. And of course, as we'll see, I'm from Jamaica. So for all those Afro-Caribbeans in Canada or whoever may be viewing, welcome. Well, if you're keeping well. But I also have to begin with a reflection on loss. Right now, we're in the midst of a pandemic. That's why we're meeting this way. And as we know, when we meet in the midst of a pandemic, it means we're meeting also in the midst of death. So many people have lost so many loved ones over the past year. And what's heartbreaking is that so many people would be alive if it weren't for misinformation, disinformation, and in some cases, downright malevolence. And what many people don't understand when we lose loved ones is that we lose what's in our life, a world. It's crushing. We lose the irreplaceable. Before I logged on today, I also was at a service in Johannesburg. This is a very good friend. I don't think he would mind my saying his name, Barnaby Barrett. He's a philosopher in psychoanalysis and a fellow Jew. And he had recently he and his partner went to a conference in Tanzania. But as we know, in Tanzania, there was a lot of denial over the significance of COVID-19, to the point where, as in some countries, there was pressuring for people not to wear masks, not to follow important protocols, etc. And poor Barnaby, his partner, he contracted COVID-19. They were hospitalized, and he returned from Tanzania alone. As the service went for his loved one, for his deceased wife, he said one of those things before he recited the mourner's Kaddish. And for those who are not Jews, this is what Jews recite at a service, at a funeral. We also do it on Shabbat, on Friday service. We also do it we also recite it in certain periods where we're acknowledging those we have lost. And you'll never hear the loved one's name. It's a testament to God. But before he recited the mourner's Kaddish, he said, he'll forever thank her for amplifying love in his heart. And yeah, you could imagine, although it's virtual, as I recited with them and said, Amen, the power of that collective loss is such that it's something that connects us all the time, with the understanding of love. I also would like to say, in this reflection of loss, I would also like to bring up the reflection on love. Because you see, love is how we build meaning against the abyss. There are those who think of love in very narcissistic ways. You know the type. I love you. Why? Because you're like me. But that's individuals who just want to have the mirror of themselves. But there's another kind of love, a paradoxical love. The love that reaches forth, that crosses the divide. The love in the elation of others, the love in the freedom of others, the love in the understanding that always, always there's something greater than yourself. The love born of humility and the love born from elation and joy in life. I talk about that love because, as you'll see in this lecture, it's a part of how I see Jewish life and how I see the very question of what's demanded in the challenges raised around liberation from the African diaspora. We could talk about love, though, in concrete ways. I, for instance, I was born in the island of Jamaica. But to say that doesn't really mean much because people got to be born somewhere. But the thing about born in the island of Jamaica in 1962, in the midst of a few months before British colonialism began to retreat and Jamaica became an independent island in August, I always quote that I was born in a colony and I began to speak in a post-colony. In that world is a world where colonialism brought so many communities together, which is why there could be a person like me. In my case, for instance, my great-grandmother, who was the daughter of an Irish Sephardic Jewish woman who migrated to the island of Jamaica, a Scottish man who had a child with a Tamil woman. It's a complicated story there because she was enslaved. Well, that woman, my great-grandmother, had a situation where she decided she was going to leave her home. And if some of you notice my name, the R in my name is for Ricardo. And I discovered this story because I had visited the island of Cuba. And when I returned to my grandmother, the daughter of my great-grandmother, found out when I brought her a gift from Cuba, she told me this story. And basically, my great-grandmother had decided to elope. She told her family off and left to go meet her Cuban lover. But as she went to the docks, all packed up and ready to go, he stood her up. Heartbroken, she was sitting on the docks crying. But the merchant marines came in, and a tall black man, about 6'10", in his 50s, she's 20 years old, from the country of Liberia, walked off the ship and saw this woman. And you could imagine, I just described her background. He talked to her and asked her what's going on. And he said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll walk you home and talk to your parents." Now you have to picture, this is British colonialism. We're talking about, the turn of just the beginning of the 20th century. Anyway, they walked, it was about 2.5 hours to get to her home from the docks. And when they arrived, as they were talking and so forth, he looked at her and he said, We should get married. So they turned around and they went and they got married. Well, that man lived to be 110. It's powerful what love could do. In fact, as a child, I spent many hours on his lap talking to him because he was blind by the time I was born, so I only knew him. He only knew me through my voice, my smell, my touch. And it was striking after he died. He died when I was 16. Because my great-grandmother, she then visited all of her grandchildren or great-grandchildren, and who were by then living in the States. And after she visited them, she told us she was going to die. And remember, everybody thought this was absurd, so we took her to the hospital, and the physicians looked at her and said, "This is a really healthy woman in her 80s. She's fine." I said, "No, I'm going to die." They said, "We'll keep her for observation." And the next day we had the phone call. She died. She just wanted to see what the fruits of that love brought. It was extraordinary that meeting, that walk was actual love. But the strange thing about the story, of course, is that it was she who gave me my middle name. And you may notice R is for Ricardo. So I don't know, I think my great-grandmother was a little bit of a trickster. She loved my great-grandfather, but somehow she got her Ricardo. Now, in this story, my grandmother married a Palestinian Jewish man from people who moved from Jerusalem from the 19th century. And already I'm telling a Jewish story that for some of you may seem like an atypical Jewish story, but it's actually a very typical Jewish story, as we will see. Because it's a story about movement, about diaspora, and it's a story about love and its challenges. And in my case, those challenges are such that when my mother migrated to New York with only $5 in her pocket, when I found myself in a situation growing up in the Bronx, New York, with all the racism, the hatred, the brutality, etc. And even last year, when I found myself afflicted with COVID-19 and in so much pain that I was going through hallucinations, I found myself enjoying one of my hallucinations. And that was the beauty of all my dead relatives. There they were in my bedroom, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my great-grandfather, my father, my mother, who's also passed. And they laughed and we had a great time together. And I remembered, as I'm enjoying that, it felt comforting. I remember thinking, normally when I dream of dead people, I have this ability to psychoanalyze my dreams. So I would talk with them and then I'd say, "It's too bad you're dead," and they always get pissed off. And they say, "Oh, well, you got to bring that up." And then they leave. So as I'm there in the midst of COVID-19, the pain, the suffering, the everything, it's holistic. It hits your entire body, head to toe. I was enjoying them and they said, "Oh, well, it's too bad you got to leave." And they didn't leave. And at that moment I thought, did I just die? And then they all start to crack up. "No, you're not dead. You'll be all right." And so it was. Because it's now a year later, and I'm here with you. And many of you with whom I'm now speaking, we're here in a world that, despite all of the things people may say about physical distance, we're not socially distant. You see, physical distance keeps you from disease, but social distance is different. As I always say to people, you can be physically close, but socially distant. Think, for example, of a bad marriage. But thanks to the benefits of some creative individuals of the past, those ancestors, among them a woman in England by the name of Ada Lovelace, who found out the algorithm for the computer, a Jewish woman by the name of Hadi Labar, who developed wireless technology, we can be physically close. I'm sorry, we can be physically distant, but socially close to the wonders of this technology to communicate. And with that in mind, I'm going to offer some reflections that I hope will be very useful, especially in light of the namesake of this lecture. So to begin with, Africana Jewish studies. Well, you have to figure out what is Africana and what do I mean by Africana Jewish studies, okay? And when we say this, we're talking about dispersed identities of people who simultaneously can be in more than one place. When I talk about Africana Jewish studies, I have to mention what led me to even get involved with this. Because you see, I had no idea when as a child in the Bronx and growing up in New York City and dealing with the many challenges that I faced that I would become a professor. And I did not, when I became a philosophy professor, I'm from a world in which the way we think of what it is to be Black and to be Jewish were not incompatible. Okay? So you could imagine as I got more known and began to travel around the world, and I would use an example about being Jewish. Some people, you know, it's like those parties where things are going well, and then someone would say, yeah, and by the way, about me being Jewish, it's like, and I was like, what? And I began to realize that there are people who treat people like me as if we were, in the realm of language, oxymorons. I remember I was giving a lecture in Salvador, Brazil once. This is back in 2005, where I mentioned that. And they wanted me to talk more about that. And I said, I'll finish my main lecture and I'll talk about this topic 3 days later. And in the 3 days, but they said, but you know, there are no Jews around here. And when we think of Jews, we don't think of people who look like you. So I said, okay, well, let's talk 3 days from now. So I went hanging out in Salvador, Brazil, and I put my Judar on. Now, whenever I say that, people get a little nervous. What do they mean by Judar? And it'll take me some time to explain this philosophically. But let's just say that when you're a member of a community, you develop cues, resources on how to spot each other in your actions, in your deeds. So I went hanging out in Salvador, and if I thought somebody was Jewish, I would just walk up to that person and ask, are you Jewish? And every time I did, the person turned out to be Jewish. I even went to take a tram, and there was a dark-skinned Black woman, and she was the ticket person. And I said, are you Jewish? And she smiled, and she took out a necklace with a Magen David, a Star of David. And she was so happy to be identified. So when I opened my lecture 3 days later, I said, boy, for a place with supposedly no Jews, there are a lot of Jews around here. What's even funny about Brazil is one of the first big streets in Brazil was in Cachoeira. And the name of the street, the original name of the street, would you believe this, was Jew Street. It was then changed to Goat Street and then Broad Street. So this already tells you something very unusual. It always tells you something right away that you need to know, okay? And what you need to know is that if you're going to talk about African diasporic people or Black people, and you're going to talk about Jewish people, you're going to be talking about peoples on which everybody has an opinion and very few people actually have knowledge. Okay? It happens all over the place. If you, in the academy, for instance, you can, everybody in the academy has an opinion on Black studies, but few people even know what the hell Black studies is and what people do. And it's the same thing everywhere you go. People have an opinion about Jews. And hardly anybody knows anything about real serious stuff about Jews. And what's even scarier, some of the most ignorant people about Black people are Black people. And some of the most ignorant people about Jews are Jews. So that's even worse, because what you have in those cases are absolutely cocky, self-assured, arrogant ignorance. W.B. Du Bois, the famous African-American historian, philosopher, poet, sociologist, the list goes on, reflected in Soliloquy on My Life in the last decade of his 20th century, that he realized that being black didn't mean he knew black people, because knowing black people from the point of view of studies, of science, of research, is a different kind of knowing. So that already gives you a sense of what Africana Jewish Studies is about. I remember when I created Center for Afro-Jewish Studies, it's funny too, it shows you how things get. Some people thought, oh, you mean a center for the study of blacks and Jews, or black and Jewish relations? And I was like, no, Afro-Jews, black Jews. And they're like, what do you mean? But then someone said, you mean Jewish diversity? But if I were to say Jewish diversity, problem is many people, I've seen people think of Jewish diversity as just talking about anything from the different Jewish denominations to Jews with disabilities, as an example. So there are all these skirting around race issues that happen when it comes to talking about Jews. So the reason I said Afro-Jewish Studies is because it compels people to ask questions. I wanted people, even if they at first appear to be ignorant questions, to be comfortable asking them. Because in the process of asking questions, you begin to learn, okay? So one of the first things I'm going to do now is going to outline some themes that I hope will be helpful. So the first one is, when you hear Africana studies, most people think black studies, but Africana studies and black studies are not identical. Africana studies includes black studies, but black studies does not have to include Africana studies. And the reason for this is because African people and members of the African diaspora don't have to be racialized peoples. You see, blackness is something that occurred in the Euro-modern world. Historically, the people of Africa had no reason to call themselves black. And what's interesting is this is something similar to what happened with Jews. And there are many people who don't realize this. Because you see, what led to the formation of black people as black people was the concept of race. It was the emergence of race and racism. If you're just in Africa, you could be Igbo, Yoruba, Wolof, Xhosa. You could be Luo, Tokoyo. The list goes on, Khoisan or Khoisan. And so if one is going to talk about how they became black, the story actually predates the Euro-modern world. It predates Columbus's landing in there and invasion of Abya Yala, which is what the indigenous peoples in the Caribbean and Latin America call it. I'm sorry, Central America. But you have to go back to Andalusia. And in Andalusia, you see, when Islam rose and went across North Africa into Central Africa and went into Southern Europe, all the way up to Southern France, the Christians took the position of the Afro-Muslim peoples who were coming in. Those Afro-Muslim peoples dominated that area for 800 years. And the term that was used to refer to those peoples altogether was a term that packed those Afro-Muslims in with, by then, predominantly Sephardic Jews. And the term was Reza. Today people say Raza because of the Spanish accent, but it was Reza. And Reza referred to species of horses, dogs, or breeds of horses, dogs, and Jews and Moors. And Reza is the word that led to the word race. So you already see something very tricky at work. Because you see, if you look at the history of race, Jews are at the very beginning, and so are Afro-Muslims together. But what's tricky is why the word Reza? Well, Reza comes from the word Ra or Re in Arabic, which means head or beginning, which is to refer to the idea of origins, because these are people who came from the south and the east. And the word is related to words like in Hebrew, Rosh, head, like when we say Rosh Hashanah, right? The new year, the beginning, the head. But it actually has ancient origins in an East African language called Meruneter. And it refers to the sun god, Re. The sun god Re, of course, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And so the word Re, which is linked in, and if I had more time, I could talk about that in the history, the ancient history of what became Judean peoples, or rather, the Hebrew Israelite people. You could see how people from the east, that race term is to say these are foreigners. Their origins are elsewhere. So you can imagine what this did for Andalusian Jews, for the people in that area, to be where they are, but being treated in the language as belonging elsewhere. Now, there are lots of other things that pop up that we should take seriously. For instance, there's the word Semite. But again, even that word, which is used to refer to Jews, right? If we get now into Jews, is very tricky because that's not a word Jews created. It's just like black is not what the people of the African diaspora or the other people who became black, like Kori people of Australia or Maori people of New Zealand. And for a long time, many of the indigenous peoples of North America, including Canada, were referred to as blacks and also the dreaded N-word. But Semite was actually originally a linguistic term. Okay, it was developed by the German historian August Ludwig von Schlütze. And it was designed to refer to Northeast African and West Asian languages such as Arabic, Amharic, Aramaic, Hebrew, Tigrinya, etc. But the Latinizing, it was based on the Latinizing of the Hebrew word Shem. And for those who are Hebrew speakers in the room, you know it refers to name. Okay? And so as we understand this, we can already see that despite a lot of the contemporary efforts, right, to escape racialization, because even though this is a linguistic term, once race was set in motion, no matter how often you may change the terms, the racial logic will re-racialize them. So just as Jews are at the beginning of race, and if it made an effort to move away from being racialized, Semite, right, becomes a racialization of the term. Just like even if you move from negro to black, say the word black, or African, or Afro-Canadian, etc., you get into the re-racialization of it. Sometimes it gets very real, it gets very, very silly. I remember there was a period where some people said, you know, we referred to Nelson Mandela as an African-American president. And that is, again, was because what they really wanted to say, the first black president of South Africa. And so once we begin to see this, we begin to realize then that once it's racialized, then hatred of Jewish people become anti-Semitism, which was coined by the Austrian Jewish scholar Moritz Steinschneider. But here's the tricky thing, and I'll come back to it. This was being treated as separate from racism because, as we know, Jews do not really fought, many Jews fought not to be a racialized category. Now, although there is a lot of effort to escape being a racialized category by appealing to Judaism, it always struck me that most people who hate Jewish people don't know a damn thing about Judaism. In fact, there's a basic fact that most people who hate Jews, they just hate Jewish people as a group. And as a consequence, their hatred is a racial hatred. Just as Moors or Afro-Muslims were among the groups initially forming the proto-race concept, and Jews were, this led to the idea of Jewish race. Now, what some people may point out, of course, is that there's a vast diversity of Jewish people. So to refer to a Jewish race as a problem. But the problem is that that's bad faith, because it distorts how race is actually used. Everybody knows that people could belong to the same race, but look morphologically different. An example I often give is, imagine look at a bunch of zebras. From an outsider's point of view, they're just a bunch of zebras. But from zebras' point of view, they look as different as every one of you look at each other today. And it's because, and that makes sense, because when you're of the same family or of the same species, what you see are the differences. But what outsiders see are the similarities. So if you keep that in mind, we begin to realize that as much as there's been an effort to escape race, Jews are always being mired in it. And I'm referring to Jews a lot here because we already know that Black people are racialized. So the tricky part when you say Africana Jewish studies is you're bringing the racialization of Jews into focus. And this has been an issue that many people don't understand, that is connected actually to the very phenomena that ironically led to the effort to whiten Jews. Because the effort to whiten Jews really emerged under colonialism. And it's specifically European Jews. Because in the European colonies, the problem in the colonies is they were outnumbered by what in today's language would be people of color, the indigenous peoples, the enslaved Africans, etc. And this led to an effort to need to bring in a critical mass of people who can be properly made white. And this is what led to a kind of lure. And the lure that the colonies offered for many European Jews, because in Europe they were not white at all, was the idea that in the colonies, many of the colonies, there was an increased separation of religion from race. And because of this, if you could demonstrate your race was separated from your religion, this afforded a possibility then to have a protection as a Jewish religion, but then having access to the full citizenship as a member of the white race. Of course, this posed a lot of problems. The people who I think analyze this best, by the way, are not actually people in the Americas, race scholars here. I think the people who do this best are actually Dalit intellectuals in Southwest Asia, because Dalits make a distinction between integration and assimilation. And because we have limited time, I'll just say this. Integration puts you under the legal control of a particular society or a particular government, but assimilation becomes the criterion through which you can have full rights under that system. Well, in a lot of at least the Anglo colonies, full access meant to be white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. And so what this means for people who are not white, not Anglo-Saxon or Protestant, was not full citizenship. But for Jews, it created, at least light-skinned Jews, access to claim being white. But you might even be claimed, because of speaking English, Anglo, but Protestant. So this ironically shows how a religious category could be re-racialized. It meant mostly white, but not white enough. And this led to an obsession with purity in the colonies. But if we pick North American example, and particularly the United States, you could see a lot of these issues in Madison Grant in the 19th to early 20th century. His The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History, was the foundational text that the Germans used. It influenced, it inspired Nazi racism and eugenics. And you already know the story about how that functioned in terms of the history, not only of Jews, but also of Roma and many other groups, because there were 30 million people killed. But the fact is, given the number in proportion to the population of Jews, it was near elimination of European Jews. So even though out of that 30 million people, we're talking about 6 million Jews, when we realize the number of Jews who were in Europe, that was devastating. So we have now the genocidal understanding of what racism does. Now, I bring this up because we often talk about race in ways that are very problematic. And the American Academy and the British Academy, I mean, it's just terrible stuff on race. And I'm sorry to have to put it this way. But again, there are a lot of technical reasons for this, but it's a general audience. So what I'll just say generally is that the way technical academic formal stuff talk about race often don't match what people actually live. You see, just like before, we could talk about technical things about being Jewish, but people who hate Jews think there's such a thing as Jewish saliva, Jewish skin, Jewish smell, that's how they think of Jews. People who hate black people, that's exactly how they think. We could get into all kinds of technical things, but they believe that there's a stuff in the actual out there about you. And here's the thing that's tricky. Anybody can be transformed into that. Now, although there's a lot of discussion when we talk about European and eventually the people who became white Jews, the thing to bear in mind is that although the reality of what's available to outside of the European context, now in the Americas or in Australia and those places for those light-skinned Jews, it is rather striking that although there are many cool things that may be available in terms of access, etc., there's still Jewish hatred. And you know, there was a study recently done by J.A. Pearson and A.T. Hieronymus. It's called Race, Ethnicity, Socioeconomic Characteristics, Co-ethnic Social Ties and Health, Evidence from the National Jewish Population Survey. And what's striking is, you know, what's weird is if you look at even, don't even a moment think about black Jews and brown Jews, just think about people called white Jews. Do you know that epidemiological studies of white Jews are almost identical in the detrimental health effects suffered as black people? In other words, what that reveals is something we all know, which is to receive hate constantly is not good for your health. So given what I said, I'm going to do some defining terms, and then we can go to some question and answers. Okay, that will illuminate Afro-Jewish studies. The first thing is, I've already given a hint of what Africana means, African diaspora. And I've already pointed out African and black are not identical. The correct thing is to think is that there are Africans who are blackened or made into blacks. We know this because throughout the people who are in the African continent, there are people who are not black. But those who are made into black, that's the one story. But Jews is a more complicated story. Who in the world are Jews? Well, you see, what's tricky is this is where, again, the category blacks and Jews are similar. Because anywhere you go where there are people who are blacks, the people there believe that their blacks are the blacks. Well, similarly, anywhere you go where there are Jews, people there believe that their Jews are the Jews. And that's what makes it very difficult. Because you see, although outsiders may look at those local Jews and not be able to tell, those local people think their Jews are what Jews are really like, and that's why they could tell the difference. And similarly, Canadian blacks are very different from many US blacks, very different from many Latin American blacks, very different from many Australian blacks, and we could go down the list. So one of the things to bear in mind is that it's not only the local thing, but when we're trying to talk about Jewish people, one big issue is that we're dominated by a lot of cinematic and literary propaganda, okay? And this propaganda makes it impossible to talk about Jews without political conflicts of one kind or another. The other problem is the cinematic presentations basically make people think that Jewish people are like a Cecil B. DeMille movie. There are still people who think Moses or Moshe looks like Charlton Heston. which is really weird. But even more problematic than that is that for many people, right, there's problematic historiography that supports a white Jewish past that is premised on a very problematic view that not only of Jewish people in the past, but also of any diasporic people. And this is because it presumes that the ancestors of the people we see today who spread themselves across the globe must be homogeneous and thus are exactly like their ancestors who were initially spread out. Now, unless a population engages exclusively in incest, that ain't gonna work. In other words, what we have to understand is that all people, right, all people, when they're spread out, ultimately mix with the people among whom they're spread. Okay? And so one of the problematic ideas that's imposed upon Jewish people, a misrepresentation, is the idea that Jewish people don't have children with people who are not historically Jewish. Now that just doesn't match Jewish history, okay? It just doesn't match Jewish history. So one of the things that we have to take very seriously is the idea that we have to start getting rid of false understandings of people and start thinking about how people actually are. And when we think about how people actually are, what we know is that the very ancient people who were spread out after the Second Temple fell basically became part of a world that was the Roman Empire. And even the Roman Empire was not like the way we think of today. Most people, when they think of the Roman Empire, they think of Hollywood films or BBC television series. But the Roman Empire was a multiracial empire. There were periods where there were people morphologically white, people who were morphologically black who were emperors in Rome. It was a very diverse. Asking about the race of the people in the Roman Empire is like asking what race are the people of Manhattan Island in New York City, or Toronto, or for that point, say Montreal, or London. It's just a silly question, okay? But one of the things we have to understand is if we think about Jewish people in religious terms, even there it's very complicated because we could talk about Abrahamic people, Hebrew people, Israelite people, but Jewish people, especially since certain words were even hard to pronounce in certain languages, that came across from a very specific set of historical forces. And then when you put in that, you have to add in what happened by the time you have the 18th century and some people began to try to be Euro-modern. So you have Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, which just means other Jews are not Jewish enough. And then you have, but these are primarily European Jewish designations. And then before them, you also have Sephardi and you have Mizrahi. And then you get into even more complicated stuff. But one of the more complicated things, even when we talk about all these, is the old Jewish joke. And the old Jewish joke is this. Get two Jews together and you'll have at least three opinions. And part of that is it's part of being Jewish to argue. It's part of being Jewish to disagree. To be Jewish, so this creates a very complicated issue about who is a Jew. So Jews by birth, okay, Jews by birth become so hotly contested, but the problem is even that is tricky because it's like, which version of Judaism are you adhering to when you make this claim? You know what I'm saying? Are you Jewish through your father, through your mother? Well, if you want to know the ancient Judeans, you belong to the Judean people through your father, not your mother. It's in Rabbinic Judaism, through Talmudic, these are the Talmudic, etc., that through your mother began to dominate. But even with that, there are still Jews who, although they'll accept this mother thing, they still work from the father thing. And I'll give you a funny example. I told you my own story, but I'm Jewish through my mother. And it's funny, my maternal grandmother was always funny because you see her daughter, my mother, was Jewish on both sides. But my maternal grandmother, through whom I'm Jewish, used to tease me and say I'm not really a Jew because she took the position that you had to be really Jewish through your father. And I used to just crack up with her and say, well, fine, but for the rest of the Jewish world, I'm cool. I'm cool with it. You know, I'm cool with it. And so this is some of the complicated things in terms of figuring out Jewish people. But of course, the complicated part is even more connected to something about how Jews are constantly refining being Jewish. And the reason I'm talking about Jews a lot here, even though I'm talking about Africana Jewish studies, is because you see, in talk, you can already see the kind of nuance I'm bringing to discussion of bringing those brands of thought together. Okay? So one of the things already that I'm bringing up that we have to take very seriously is that too many people try to talk about Jewish people without talking about how people actually live through history. The actual history of Jewish people is not simply about people who go to shul or synagogue. It's not simply about how we hold up Torah or text. The history of Jewish people is also a history of dealing with constant colonization, conquest, brutalization. The history of Jewish people is dealing with issues of trade, movement, migration, etc. And it's within that understanding of all of those movements, constant movements around, that if we take colonization and all of these other factors seriously, then we begin to understand that even Jewish debates are affected by that. Think of an African debate as an example. When the British colonized an area of the world that became known as Nigeria, there were many different ethnic groups there. But those ethnic groups had to argue about whether they're going to follow Yoruba or Igbo law or British law, among the Wolof law or French law. Well, similarly, ancient Judeans were like Halakha, Jewish law, or Roman law. And you know, there are some people who are staunch. We're going to be exclusively Jewish. I mean, they weren't Jews yet. Judeans, that law. But then there were some people like, yo, you know, these Romans got some good stuff going on. You know, they got all this engineering. They got stuff like toilets. They got, you know, they got some really cool stuff here. You know, why can't we be both? And as you know, what happened in historical examples of colonialism is post-colonial situations tend to be hybrids. In other words, you borrow, you mix in, and you figure what can work. And there's a lot of Talmudic reflection, a lot of the Mishnah, a lot of arguments, a lot of things to this day about Judaism that are actually creolized or hybridizations of what it is to be Jewish. So one of the things that come out of that are so many kinds of Jews. And I got to tell you, I travel all over the world and I meet a lot of Jews. Because you see, when you create something called the Center for Afro-Jewish Studies and you have stuff like a website, I thought I had to do all this research, but you know what? They come to you. They made my work easy. I get letters from Jews all the time with Jewish stories. Oh my God, what I learn. And so I could tell you, for instance, and everywhere I go, that's why I have such good Judar, because I just learned so much of what to spot. When I'm in India, I was like, okay, this is a Jewish town. And it turns out to be Cochin. If I'm talking Bena Israel, Misurai, Baghdadi Jews of India, you could do a Kaifeng Jews of China. All of these things I spot. I remember I was even at one time when I was in Denmark, there was a friend who wanted to show me Denmark. She said she knew everything about Denmark. She walked me around to me and I walked into a neighborhood and said, yo, this was a Jewish neighborhood. And she said, what? Nobody told her it was a Jew. This woman thought she knew the history. I said, this was a Jewish neighborhood. She said, how you know? So I started walking around and show her everything, every little clue that Jews left to show that this was a Jewish neighborhood. Even the manhole covers had the Star of David in them. And so she, after I left, went back and looked into a deeper archive, and she wrote me a long letter and said, oh my God, not only were you right that it was a Jewish neighborhood, but the entire community was wiped out. They were sent out, and she felt so ashamed because of how the history rewrote that neighborhood as non-Jewish. So she now in this present, this woman wasn't Jewish, this was a Danish Lutheran, but that's the point. You learn, and this is a crucial thing about Jew. But part of being Jewish is you have an obligation to keep learning. And for many of you, if you ever want to continue this, I highly recommend for you to take some time And the best way to start learning about Jewish diversity, if you want to learn about actual Jewish history, read Jewish cookbooks. One I recommend is Claudia Rodin's The Book of Jewish Food, an odyssey from Samarkand to New York. And the reason I say this is because you see, the people who write cookbooks want the recipes. They're not going to do with this racist scholarship stuff and start with what Jews, they just want the damn recipe. And because of that, there are things that they would learn. And as they talk about it, they find out that it's a diverse community. In the island of Jamaica, for instance, one of the national dishes is a thing called escovitch fish. And there are versions of that fish that are in Jewish communities all over the world. It's just each do their local form on it. But last I heard, I don't remember meeting a typical West African with the name escovitch. And so this black dish is actually a Jewish dish that has, but each place they make it in a different way. And so for Northern European Jews, it eventually took a form that is not one of my favorites, but it's still a form as gefilte fish. But in other places where it's more African, it'll have onions and spices and allspice, and it'll be different. But it's ultimately clearly connected to Jewish food. And so once we begin to understand this, we begin to learn then that when you say Africana Jewish studies, this is about what you can learn. Because you see, you notice already we found that race, that the categories Jews and blacks were already linked in the formation of race. And we already know, we have already learned that there's also histories in terms of slavery and other issues to deal with. So I'm going to now conclude with some reflections that may bring this into home in a different way. Okay? And why I bring this up is because you see, today, because of trauma, and in some cases, just a desire to just forget, or in some cases, a desire to assimilate, many of us don't know our histories. If you were to go, for instance, and look up, Paul Johnson's A History of the Jews, you will find that he says something very peculiar. He noticed that in the Americas, early Jewish communities would go with ransom money to the slave ships. Now you may wonder, why would they do this? And it's because many early Jewish communities across the Americas, all the way down from Central America up to North America, they knew that among the enslaved Africans coming over, that there were enslaved Jews on those ships. And that's because from a white Christian outsider's point of view, black is black, baby, just rack them up. But what many don't realize is that it's estimated that up to 30% of the enslaved Africans were Muslim. And what many people don't realize is that along the trade routes, wherever there were Muslims, there were Jews. And because people tended to mix in with the local populations and had children with them, and whether they went through the right minions and so forth for conversion, whatever you will call it, it meant that there were enslaved people who were Jews. And so this already tells you that there was a history that Jews knew that has been today lost. So Africana Jewish studies must address challenges to the notion of how we ossify and fix these identities instead of understanding them. And so with that in mind, I want to make a reflection, because you see, this talk is being given right before Pesach. And for non-Jews, it's just a way of saying Passover. Okay? At Pesach, we have a ritual meal called a Seder, in which we reflect upon Shemot, names, which Christians know as the Exodus story of the Israelites' liberation from enslavement from Kemet, which everybody knows today is Egypt. Okay? Now, ask yourself, what does an Afro-Jew think about this? And when I say an Afro-Jew, I mean, the way I just talked about Jews, Afro-Jews follow that full spectrum. The Afro-Reform Jews, Afro-Reconstructionist Jews, Afro-Orthodox Jews, Afro-Ultra-Orthodox, Afro-Conservadox Jews, Among those, then you have to add in Afro-Cochin, Afro-Kaifeng, Afro-Mizrahi, Afro-Sephardic. You see where I'm going with this. And after you get all those lists of Jews, then you have to deal with the secular Jews. They're Jews who are just born Jews and they don't practice Judaism, okay? But still, culturally, even Jews who are not religious will go to a Seder. And try to think about how different it is for a Black Jew at a Seder to think about this story of liberation. Because you see, when you're Black and you sit down and you think about this, your relationship to enslavement isn't remote. You're not thinking about approximately 300 to 4,000 years ago. You're thinking about not only a short time ago, there's still Black people enslaved today. Not only that, but you also think about the very complex history of Jewish peoples, and there are people who, when they think about the connection, say white Jews, because of the complicated history of conversions and many other things, because a lot of Jews today don't know that in the early periods of the first 200 to 300 years after the fall of the Second Temple, those Jewish populations in Rome were proselytizing, and they were converting a lot of people to Judaism. But again, I mentioned earlier, the Roman Empire was multiracial. So in that world, when you say you're going to meet a Jew, you don't know what physically the person would look like. It wasn't until Constantine began to where it became punishable by death to convert somebody to Judaism, that Jews, that's a quick way to make sure you only marry your own kind, that Jews began to marry Jews only. And just as a matter of over the course of history, certain markers began to appear. That's why there's certain lines of Jewish marked diseases, etc. But whom they end up in is another story. There are a lot of Black people that have no idea they have Jewish ancestry, and they show up with Tay-Sachs disease, or lots of other markers and links. Okay, I know of people who turned out not even to know until well in their adult life that their parents never told them that they were Jewish. So, and there's a wonderful professor at Dalhousie, Chike Jeffers. He and I had a great conversation about that. Because of his Guyanese background, there's a strong Jewish background there. And I know many very famous feminist theorists who discover that they are Jewish. So if you reflect upon this issue, a very profound existential question comes up. Because you see, there is a fact that if one identifies with whiteness, then one has to deal with the spirit of seriousness as the materialization of values. And the materialization of values that's linked to white supremacy is the idea that Jewishness, if one rewrites Jewish history into whiteness, how does that whiteness comport with the story of enslavement and liberation? Because you see, there are people who would prefer to think about anti-Semitism as separate from racism, and they think about the religiosity because they don't want to deal with something in Jewish history that is about struggling with colonialism and the issue of the fight for liberation. Because you see, at the moment at the Seder, when you have to reflect upon liberation, you have to use the word we Jews. But if you say we Jews, but you want Jews only to be white, then what you want to do is defend us Jews as practicing our religion, but you want to say us whites in your social life. But the problem with that is what created whiteness was a profound commitment against liberation, against freedom, against the dignity of people who are in the category of not white. So this brings in a profound question, because that notion of making us Jews become white does grave harm to all Jews who are not white. For Black Jews, it creates the false story that Jews enter the Euro-modern world only through Christianity, which treats every Black Jew as a prior Christian. And that is an absolutely injurious and false position to take. It treats any Jew who is going to be from West Asia as if mediated through some other religion. And in some cases, these are people who are from Jews who have been practicing Judaism nonstop for 1,000 years or 2,000 years. And so if we begin to do this, it deals with something that's an affront to Judaism. And that's the problem of idolatry. I have a good friend, a secular Jew, but it's very funny because she always crows. She says, I don't go to shul or synagogue. And I say to her, why? And she said, I don't go to shul because I believe in God. And then she smiles. And many Jews would know what she means by this. Because you see, the moment idolatry goes into Judaism, Judaism's in trouble. The moment idolatry comes in, this is one of the elements of anti-Black racism because it makes whiteness into an idol. It makes the vestiges that support whiteness, like Euro-modern capitalism, which says nothing must exist outside of it, so it commodifies everything, into an idol. But Jews are supposed to be the people who fight against idolatry. When we hold up Torah, the teachings, it's not simply the living word of God we're talking about. It's to take on the responsibility for ethical life, for responsibility itself. And when we think about what that means, to embrace ethical life, it means actually what a Jew is about, is something that Black liberation struggles is about. And that is the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, repairing of the world or repairing of the earth. Because it means that even though you may declare yourself a Jew, or even if you declare yourself Afro-Jew or whatever kind of Jew or Black, you are actually announcing, taking on the obligation of constantly becoming a Jew, becoming an ethical person, becoming a person who fights for the freedom of others, becoming a person who fights against oppression, and what you realize is that it becomes not about you. And so it's with that in mind that I implore many of you, in the spirit of Tikkun Olam, to understand the humility, the power, the joy of understanding what it is to live ethical life as an obligation to reach out for something greater than yourself. And I say that because the namesake of this series is about that very issue, Because what we find, whether it's going to be from Auschwitz, whether it's the Inquisition, whether it's enslavement, we can go on and on to the domination, the degradation, whether it's about misogyny. There's a long list of degradations, whether it's about DACA workers or so forth. It all comes back to that courageous question to act. And to act from that commitment of radical love for ethical responsibility means you're acting for those whom you will never meet, you will never know, and they may never know you. But when they look back, they can say thank you because you acted from those who did not have to be named, but are irreplaceably precious. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon. That was so stimulating. And there are questions coming in. They're going to be published in a minute. So I think I might actually, before they're published, go ahead and ask a question that I have that I'm a Jewish woman. This is what we do. We ask questions immediately. I just kept thinking, I went to the Charles C. Smith Jewish Day School in Rockville, Maryland, and we were always taught consistently to be Jewish is to have an ethnic identity, right? That you may choose to be religious, but essentially it comes down to this matrilineal descent. And they were always very careful to say it's an ethnic identity. It has nothing to do with race. And so I realized, right, it is a response to Nazism. And what they were really saying was Jews are not mired in race, as sort of a misplaced effort to reject or deny like Hitler's specific racialization of the Jews. But it did lead to a Jewish education in which we were taught about anti-Semitism as if historically it had no connection whatsoever to anti-Black racism. And I still think that's how a lot of, at least American Jews, learn about Jewish history and anti-Semitism, which is historically inaccurate. And the consequence, I think, today is that it's really, really complicated and hard to talk about the racialization of Jews, especially as a white Jew in North America, who is seen as white by most people until you're not. I mean, it's so complicated. I just feel like the most we can say is, like as a white American Jewish woman, I am not Black and I am white, but sometimes not white enough. It's just a complicated situation. And I think that a lot of Jews who are anti-racist feel that part of being a good ally is understanding that as white Jews, we don't participate in Black consciousness. There are limits to what we can understand. We don't have the same vulnerabilities, and that needs to be emphasized. But also with the consequence that it's difficult to talk at all about the specificity of anti-Jewish sentiment that we do feel. And so this is all going through my mind as I heard you talk, and I was just wondering, like, how can we actually continue that dialogue, given that the last thing most Jews know how to talk about or even want to talk about is that we are, and I just love your language, that's why I keep repeating it, that we are mired in race, and that I do think historically and culturally it's important to bring the racialization of Jews and all of its complexity into focus so that we can disabuse ourselves of the misperception that Jews are white people now, or that most Jews, as you say, sort of became white, all of which leads to a situation in which, as you're saying, Jews think their Jews are the real Jews, right? And this, I think, leaves us culturally impoverished, aside from just being wrong and ignorant, right? Like, leads to a situation where we can't enjoy and identify with, like, the beauty of our tradition and the diversity of our tradition. Although I will also say, in terms of the food thing, every Passover, I'm always wishing I was Sephardic, right? That's what you always think as an Ashkenazi Jew, because you're like, oh my God, you're like, okay, this week I'm Sephardic though, so I can have the rice. Like, just please, can I have the rice?
Man, I could tell you one of the things, it's so funny. It's funny, one of the things I love from the Jewish world I come from is the food. And what's so funny is I didn't know, I didn't realize it was Jewish food, because you see, it's just like I had the same thing. I thought my Jamaicans were the Jamaicans until it's so funny, because I grew up with Jewish Jamaican food. And so it was really funny when my kids at one point, we went to go meet some other Jamaicans and they made Jamaican food. And my kids were so pissed. They were like, I thought it was Jamaican food. We realized, oh, we grew up with a different kind of Jamaican food. It is Jamaican food, but with a Jewish take. And so the thing that's really funny, though, is our Seders, every time we have to, because the old joke about Jewish rituals, they tried to kill us, we survived, and now we eat. And so, but with us, we love the eating, and I love cooking. I'm from a long line of women who cook for entire communities. I cook for weddings, for, bat mitzvah and bar mitzvah services, etc. And there are people who, they want me to cook the food, etc. But the thing, and so for us, they're just great food. In fact, I just love doing it. For us, it's just great. But the thing I want to say is this. The first thing everybody has to bear in mind is that I think one of the damages done by liberal political theory and Euro-modern racism has been a conception of human beings that is so false but dominates us all. It makes us treat ourselves as complete, whole, and that we have to be perfect, and it's very moralistic. Judaism reminds us all the time that people are imperfect. Your obligation is to just do your best and keep working at it. And okay, you fell down, you failed today. Get up and try your best tomorrow. Just keep trying your best. I say this because, as a precursor, to say that when we moralize what it is to work with each other, we lose sight that the real reason we're supposed to get out of the streets and fight against racism and sexism, but even more, why we have to fight today against fascism, is because ultimately we're fighting for democracy, for freedom, for dignity. If we focus on what we're fighting for, we don't have to deal with whether our egos are bruised or so forth, because there are people who undermine that. Even the languages, when people call people allies, it's making it sound like it's who properly should be outside of doing the right thing. Every human being should be inside doing the right thing. So I never use the language of allies. Okay, period. I don't think I have to be an ally with women if something is wrong and is sexist. I have to go against it because it's wrong. You see what I'm saying? Now, in terms of the historical part, it's important to keep learning because, when Arthur de Gobineau wrote on the inequality of the human races, you know how he wrote about Jews? He described Jews as mulattoes. Okay? And part of it is not entirely off, but, it's in his racist logic. But, we're talking about people from East Africa and West Asia. And, ancient Africa had no reason to think of itself as stopping at the Suez Canal. So people in ancient Africa just kept going up, and people who are in more the European side kept going down, and people from the Asian side, you know what I'm getting at. And when people keep flowing back and forth and trading, at some point, Marvin Gaye starts. You know what I'm talking about. Let's get it on. And babies are born. So the fact of the matter is, even if you want to use those kind of logic, it's just really dumb, those things. But here's the thing. When Gobineau was saying the Jews are mulattoes, he was really saying that there's a pure race of people who are Europeans and white. But even that is false. There's no such thing as pure European. I mean, most race stuff is just lies. Because a lot of people don't even realize, in the past when people did race stuff, it's because they believed the original race was white. So their racist logic was, how did black people and brown people show up? And they were in the logic of deviation, you see? But of course, actual science reveals that there was a time there were no people morphologically white around at all. In fact, the people today we call white people haven't even been around for more than 8,000 or 9,000 years. So everybody we call white people today are just lightened up black people. So that's just the truth. Now, we know right now, that's why it's being kept a little quiet. Because could you imagine if the opposite were discovered? Oh my God. But anyway, the reason I bring this up is because, you see, the actual history of Jews who study race is a rather interesting one. Because Franz Boas, as an example, was a physicist, a German Jewish physicist, who could not be hired in Germany because he was a Jew. There are a lot of famous Jews who actually converted to Lutheranism to get jobs. Even though they're at home, they were practicing Judaism. So he ended up working as a researcher with the Laplanders and other groups. And what happened is he ended up looking into cultural anthropology and race. And he became one of the great people who developed theories against race. And in the US, as you know, he became a major cultural anthropologist. And he trained people to become anthropologists, such as Ashley Montagu, who was one of the people who developed the whole anti-racist discourse that affects a lot of Judaism today, Jewish communities today. But he also trained people like James Weldon Johnson, Zora Neale Hurston, who are famous Africans. You see how the plot thickens. And in addition to that, he was a person who was a big proponent of understanding African history, because he argued that the damage done to African history hurts not only black people, but it hurts humanity, because it misrepresents the actual history of humanity by creating the false notion that only people who are white are thinking agents of history. And so already one of the things is we shouldn't be so afraid of taking the time to learn the history and study it, and also to understand that we should deal with our imperfections. Because one of the things I could tell you is what led me to doing Jewish studies, which is that response I told you about in the beginning, was just to explain things. But before you know it, if you start doing it enough, research enough, suddenly one day you're a professor of Jewish studies as well, and blah, 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 blah. And then it goes on and on and on. So the thing is, a lot of people are so afraid because they think if you actually understand the history and you actually understand the complexity of how we live, you'll discover things of which to be ashamed. But the truth of the matter is you also find things of which to be proud. There are inspiring stories there. But even with the shameful stories, the thing to remember is human beings are not perfect. And in those stories, learning the complexity of each other is exactly why we have the opportunity to build a better future, to understand our relationship to these issues. So my response is put our egos to the side, do it because it's right. If I'm working with any struggle, and say, I just pick one example, if I was dealing, because I'm also a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies. If I'm there, if it's a moment, if a woman colleague says, that there's a certain way I'm behaving that may be inappropriate, say in a way that's mansplaining something, that would be wrong. And put the ego to a side, and you know what you say? Sorry. Let's now just continue dealing with the problem. End of story. But too many people are just worried about their ego, and we should get on to dealing with the big problems. I don't have to have gone through another person's suffering to recognize that they're suffering. And so there are struggles right now. In my case, it's different because I'm so mixed. I'm related to almost everybody. So, but let's say I wasn't, because my paternal grandmother's Chinese. So let's just say I wasn't also East Asian. Suppose I wasn't also Southwest Asian. Suppose I wasn't Palestinian Jewish. Suppose I wasn't Sephardic Jewish. Suppose. I still have the obligation to be outraged at the degradation of those people. It just so happens that they're also my people. Do you see what I'm getting at?
I do. That's very helpful. Yeah, Shar, I'm going to read one of the questions now that we got from actually you can hear me, right, Doctor? This question actually comes from a former student of mine who's writing in from the United States. Good Jewish boy, good Jewish man. So he wrote, could you, I don't even understand the question. Could you speak more about the Kemetic origin of the Hebrew Israelites? I honestly don't know what that refers to.
Okay, could I have, because I know I'm not sure when the cutoff time was. If there are more questions, could we get some more out so the audience could get to hear them, and then I'll answer them.
Can you? One of them is so long. I'm not sure if you can.
Try it anyway.
Oh, okay. Okay. They're also just coming in right now. So it's very long. Okay. Thank you for the excellent talk. While I agree entirely with your presentation of the historical development of race as ideology and caste institutions, I do think there's an interesting way of complicating the idea that racialization had its single origin during colonialism. The Umayyad dynasty was overthrown in, I believe, 8th century AD by the Abbasid revolution, and one of the major goals of the Abbasids was granting rights to citizenship and conversion to Islam to non-Arab peoples, which doesn't necessarily suggest racialization itself. But then during the following Abbasid dynasty, you had the slave trade that brought the East Africans, referred to as Zanj, to Mesopotamia, where there was, of course, the Zanj rebellion in the 9th century. And contemporary documents suggested a racialization of the Zanj, with the Abbasid scholar Al-Jahiz, whose grandfather was a Zanj camel driver, presenting a defense of the Zanj as not marked black by God, but after traveling to East Africa, heard from them themselves that it was simply the sun that made them black. He also provides a defense of the civil and intellectual qualities of the Zanj in a way that heavily implies he was arguing against contemporaries of his that were engaged in a racialization of morphologically black Africans. Of course, this is not the origin of contemporary racialism, but I think it's an interesting case study in a separate development of racialization as something other than a totally contingent historical fluke. I'm wondering how this might be incorporated into your broader analysis.
Good. And keep going. I want that way those who see the recording could get to, I don't want to, it would be great if a lot of people's questions come out.
I love this one from David Zittner. Is there a Haggadah that formally includes references to current racism and slavery? Or for most people, does my people, Haggadah, really refer to all people? And then Joanna Wexler, who is the president of the Conservative Synagogue. Shout out to Joanna. I want to thank you so much for this. As both a teacher of Jewish history at our Hebrew school here in Halifax and very involved at the Shar, that's the synagogue, this has been so inspiring. Listening to you, I am brimming with ideas for discussions and programming, and I would love to connect more about this. Just today, a member of the shul sent in a suggestion about us hosting the International Jewish Food Series when it is safe to do so. First, can you repeat or maybe write down the name of the cookbook you mentioned? Secondly, can you recommend some texts around Africana Jewish studies that would give me a good foundation in developing some programming for youth in our community?
Is there another one?
I think that's all for now.
Okay. Well, the first thing I would like to say, well, just quickly, for the cookbook, look up. And what's great about this is there's so much nuance to Jewish life, Jewish thought. It's Claudia Rodin's R-O-D-E-N, The Book of Jewish Food. It's published by Knopf, okay? New York, Knopf. It's subtitled An Odyssey from Samarkand to New York. And what I'll do is some of these, I will send you links. I will send to Lissa, all right? I'll send links, okay? That way, since it's in, Halifax, they could contact you if they would like, okay? So that's the first thing, okay, to listen. Today, because one of the things, you can't in just a short moment go through the full panoramic of what we're doing and what I do methodologically, right? So one of the first things I'd like to say is I'm adamantly against models that try to understand human phenomena in a kind of single essential narrative, okay? Adamantly against. I agree with Antoine Firmin from Haiti in 1885, who wrote the response to Arthur de Gobineau, by the way. Okay, just for people to know, because there's a tendency to not understand that there were Black writers and also Jewish writers, in terms of Afro-Jewish writers who wrote responses. Okay, so that's the thing. But what the man argued, which is something I agree with, is that the human reality, the human being always exceeds the disciplinary categories. So each discipline is like an effort to look at an elephant from one angle. You see what I'm saying? And so we need, when I talk about the specific one I'm talking about, the line I was talking about of racialization is what led to our contemporary Euro-modern construction of race. And it's not actually singularly a case from colonialism. It's multiple stories. Actually, the story I was telling is a mixture of the unique formation of Christianity, the emergence of Islam that split it in such a way that, because the early Christianity's histories was actually in Africa, but once Islam came, another part of it began to happen in Northern Europe. Then you mix into it the economic depression that occurred. 800 years of a lack of trade is when you go from Romans having indoor toilets to people throwing a piss pot out the window. It's a whole different world. And then you have within it a theology of reconquest that took to the seas. Today we have a historiography that looks at Columbus and them as explorers. No, they were at war. These were people who saw themselves as reconnaissance. And so when you have war, a lot of people don't know the history of Christianity was a history of warfare. Christian soldiers, the knife, the might, it was bloody. And today we have this love and peace and imagining Christians sitting in the, with the lions coming into the Colosseum, but it was a whole other story. And that will take a long time to go through to explaining how brutal, how much destruction on the ancient world Christianity, was engaged in. But so that warlike group then had another thing, because you see, suddenly when you're coming back from what they thought was meeting the lost tribes of Israel, as they called them, which is very fun. Well, clans actually. Tribe is a complicated notion that came up later. But just the nature of the economy was such that the kind of stuff you were bringing back to Europe made you filthy rich. And so now you had a burgeoning capitalism that had within a burgeoning colonialism, that had within a need for labor that had enslavement, and all these multiple factors came in that shifted into a form of idolatry in which literally capitalism became God. And within that framework, the subject for God had to be those chosen as deserving these fruits. It's not the Jewish conception of what it is to be called by God. Whether it's Behir or Bachar, it's where a lot of people don't realize this, but there are people who mistakenly associate with Judaism the notion of chosen people to mean better than other people. No. Every Jewish story of being chosen, you run from God. You're terrified because you know what's going to happen. God calls you, and at first you're young, you're cool, you're like, I'm the Mac Daddy. God calls you, and after you do what you're to do, you're like, you know what I mean? That's why Jonah ran, right? And the story, Moshe didn't want. So it's because carrying the burden of ethical life is difficult. So, but that's not a Christian concept. The Christian concept is of God as an ontological being, thing, with nothing outside, and you can name it, that kind of a thing. And so the correlated subject that emerged in the Euro-modern world was a subject called white people. I advised a thesis once I didn't advise it, I was examining a thesis where the author had a chapter called What Do White People Want? And he went through all kinds of technical stuff of literature and so forth. And I said to him, a lot of people of color and a lot of white people actually have a short, concise answer to this. And he said, what is it? I said, everything. That's what whiteness is. The belief you have the right to everything, even the right to be identified as the victim. And so what happens in that framework is that is more relevant to what we're dealing with now. You see? Now, there were different kinds of racialization in their own logic. So the questionnaire who was pointing out, for instance, about the more eastern areas of what was going on. And there's even an earlier one if we talk about, for instance, what was happening with the Persian groups such as Mani and others, and even earlier with the kind of movements into the Indus Valley that set up their own logic. But the thing about those is those eventually met back up under the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, etc. So, but that's a longer story. In terms of the first questionnaire, though, the very ancient story, when I teach my classes, when I teach, say, philosophy, I actually begin philosophy in 4,000 years ago. I began in 1900 BCE with writings from Kemet. And for those who want to know, Kemet is, again, it just means dark lands. It's ancient, what we call Egypt. Egypt was the Greek name of the temple in Memphis, Aegyptos. And when many ancient groups colonize an area and they choose their primary city, they rename the whole region that way. So to give you an example, the Roman name for Philistia was Palestine. And so when the temple fell and they became under complete Roman control, they renamed the entire area Palestine, just for some of you to know. And my point, the reason I'm bringing this up is, you see, what a lot of people don't understand is there's a difference between the story as told by one group. But, there were, ancient stories about what was happening in ancient East Africa, to the point where Josephus wrote to try to counter them. But the Christians later destroyed a lot of the actual texts that were written by what we call today the Egyptians. But Josephus had read them, and he translated them into long commentaries to counter them, because the people of then, by that point, Egypt, were suing the people of Judea for the goods that were in the temple, because they said they were stolen. And so it's a funny story. You have Jewish lawyers and you have Egyptian lawyers and Josephus and all of this coming in. But the actual story goes back farther than you may think. It goes back to Amenhotep and Nefertiti, or Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And a lot of people don't know that Nefertiti was also a philosopher. Her name means beautiful woman, but she was also a philosopher. A lot of people didn't know this. And they developed the emanation theory of reality. And the emanation theory means that that which emanates reality is invisible. And that's why under Akhenaten and Nefertiti, they began to disrupt the many temples in ancient Kemet, because they were trying to articulate a form of monotheism in which God was nameless. Now, the problem was a lot of the ancient economy of Kemet was linked to the various gods. So if you overnight turn over the gods, you're going to create rampant unemployment. You're going to create a devastating economic situation. And to make a long story, the people then revolted and eventually killed them and blah, blah, blah. But there were people who were convinced by this, and they continued the faith, so to speak. And there are many commentaries on this. Freud even wrote a commentary on it. But the main point is, by then, those peoples were a mixture in terms of northern Egypt, which is, in Egyptian term, lower Egypt, because a lot of people don't understand this, but in the ancient world, people looked up to Africa and down to the Mediterranean. And the reason was because the Nile River flowed into the Mediterranean. And so people always say downriver. So that's why they thought of the Mediterranean as down. Now, those people, as they were mixing in with people from the Levant, which today we just call the Middle East, that group of people, became the groups who were more the foundational groups that led into what was not. You see, a lot of people forget that Judea is a very specific area. There were a lot of people all the way up to what would be today Syria, and all the way over to Jordan and other areas, all the way over, who are following these Egyptian practices. But different revolts would emerge. And one of the things about Jerusalem that made it very special, it's a mountain, and it's a good way to fortify yourself, especially against taxes. And eventually, if you think about the vast expanse we're talking about, you could start with a root language, and if you're mixing with other languages, there's a certain point where you begin to get more distinct. And so the first questioner, that was the formation of what was what we call Jewish, but was more East African, West Asian way of living. It's a complicated story what led to specifically Judea as a center. But even there, we have to talk about the fall of the first temple, the building of the second temple, the complicated story of the Hasmonean Empire, what led to there being Hanukkah, the whole thing. But what happened is it led to, once the second temple fell, a real issue emerged, because you see, there are things about ancient Judaism, and it wasn't pronounced Jew. That's actually coming from another language, because there was no J sound. It was Judaism, right? There were things like animal sacrifice, and there were all kinds of other things that could only be done in the temple. There was also, I like this part, there was a lot of smoking of the holy herb. There's a lot of marijuana smoking and drinking and etc. But what happened was a very interesting and a wonderful text on this is by Shia Cohen, The Beginnings of Jewishness. Because you see, there weren't Jews technically then, okay? It's the point at which people who were not from Judea, who were put in charge of Judea and following Judean rules, that now created the question, if you follow these rules, these ways of life, what are you? And as more people began to follow that way of life, the term, because as it spread in the Roman Empire, that it was coming from Judea or Judea, it increasingly began to be described as Jews, okay? But they did not call themselves Jews. And so a lot of people don't know Jews, as we say today, is actually, in terms of the history of our species, very recent. However, it's a complicated story about how ancestors relate to descendants. Because when we say we, like at a Seder, or if we say, we're talking about an ethical we that connects people. You see what I'm saying? It's not about a biological we. And once we understand that commitment to become that we, that is what's really powerful about those people being formed. And now it develops a whole complex history on how to build our understanding of ourselves. And in terms of the Hebrew Israelites, there's already, this is why, what the Hebrew Israelites, it's complicated. There are people who call themselves Hebrew Israelites who are not properly what we'll call Judeans or Jews, right? But there are people who are Hebrew Israelites who are Jews. And what they point out is that the people I just talked about, the very ancient ones, were not what we would call today white. That's what they point out. But the thing to bear in mind, that the people we do call white are Jews. You see, that there are some people who take the extreme of a kind of authenticity that say, if you're not, again, that's why I criticize that fallacy of saying the descendants of a people must look like their ancestors. But the fact is, whoever come into this people we call Jews, those people are the Jewish people. So for me, from the whitest to the darkest, you're Jews. End of story.
We do actually have time for one more question that came in, and it's actually a really beautiful question that I think wraps up a lot of the dialogue tonight. And this is from Mona. How do we not engage in essentialism when people are more concerned about Jewish people than anti-Semitism, more concerned about race than racism?
I think the answer was in the question, which is focus on the racism, focus on the anti-Jewish hatred. Just focus on it, because at the end of the day, let's say somebody thought somebody was a Jew who wasn't a Jew and attacked and killed that person. Is it really relevant whether that person really was Jewish or not? That was an anti-Jewish attack. It's just the person there who suffered it turned out not to be a Jew. When I remembered when I was a kid, because one of the things, when you're from a very, what's called mixed background, you look different in different periods of your life. I have a friend where I showed her 10 pictures of me over 10 years. She thought there were 10 different people. And you look at pictures of me over the years, you'd see what I mean. Well, there's a certain point in my when I was 9 years old, I looked the way many people in the Bronx would think of in their image of a Puerto Rican. And I was playing in a yard, in a schoolyard with a friend of mine, and a group of older kids popped up with bats and sticks. And this was weird, they were white and black kids. I mean, older. And they said, "Get out of the yard, you effing Puerto Rican." And my friend, by the time I turned around, he was already over the fence. And I looked back. Now you could see the ethical issue. If I had to say, "But I'm not Puerto Rican," so I decided not to say I wasn't Puerto Rican. And I ended up having to fight them. But the thing is, but the point of the story is not about the fight itself. The reason I had to, because I did not want to be complicit in anti-Puerto Ricanness. And I didn't even realize as a kid, but it was one of these moments, you know what I mean? And it's one of these things where at the end of the day, I think Mona's question is hits the nail on the head, because it's related to your question that you asked earlier, Lissa, which is, of course, why I criticize the allyship stuff and all that, because the thing is, ultimately we focus on the actions. And I'll give an example because we're coming to an end here. The problem with the other example with moralism is some people are shocked when I say, I'm really more concerned not so much that there's some people with immoral attitudes, but the fact that people who have those attitudes tend to have power. If you disempower them, then their attitudes just become personal. And they become irrelevant to the larger project we have of building a better world. But there's some people who are so obsessed with controlling people that they make the move to be obsessed that those people have those thoughts. And they try to now exterminate those people. They want to not just stop their action, they want to stop their thought. And at that moment, the liberator becomes an oppressor. So I usually say that in the end, I would much prefer to focus on what we can do. And what we can really do is the political work of working together for Tikkun Olam.
That's so Jewish. And I do have...
Yeah, and I'm damn proud of it.
So it's so Jewish, meaning at the Jewish day school, they said to us every day, we don't care if you believe in God. Our rabbi said that to us, Orthodox rabbis. We don't care if you believe in God. Faith is beside the issue. It's what you do. It's not what you believe. And that is something that it's like one of my biggest takeaways about Jewish identity.
And that is why it was funny. When I wrote my first book, Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, I wasn't thinking about Judaism at all. But 10 years later, there was a rabbi commenting on Black Jewish thought. And he referred to that book as a book in Black Jewish thought. And I was like, huh? So I went back and read my own book. And he was completely correct. Every argument in the book was properly a Black Jewish thought. And it makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, you got to argue what you believe. And that is the way, that's what I argue for in my thought. It's not to make people Jewish. It's just that I see that thought, that project of focusing on what we can do to build a better world. End of story. And don't think about yourself. Do it because it's right. And it's right because it's connected to others. And it's so radically connected to others that you have to do it out of commitment and act of love for people you will never know.
Thank you so much. We have actually gone beyond the time. So I'm very grateful that you have stayed so long to engage in this dialogue. And of course, your last words, I think, are exactly what we need to keep in our heart right now to retain hope about the possibility of dialogue, the hope in community, and the hope of shared understanding across differences that your talk has made me realize we tend to really exaggerate as differences instead of enjoy. Anyway, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much, Dr. Worden, and this was such a special way to kick off the Irving Glovin series. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you. And to all of those who have been viewing and participating, continue being safe, healthy, and find moments of joy to remind you of your humanity. And for all of you who are Jewish out there, Chag Pesach Sameach. And for those of you who are not Jewish, Chag Pesach Sameach as well.
This is so good. Okay.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.